Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, a Democratic National Convention in Chicago, a last-minute candidate change, and massive anti-war protests. The echoes of 1968 at this week's DNC. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. The Take is in Chicago at the Democratic Convention this week, where Kamala Harris and Tim Walz will accept their nominations for the 2024 election. Chicago is my hometown.
I'm Gerard Ibn Earl Bilal.
It's his, too. That's my dad. He was there when the DNC came to the city in 1968. He was about a month away from turning 20, a year younger than the voting age in the U.S. back then, but old enough to fear being drafted into the Vietnam War.
American soldiers hiking their way through the sweaty jungles of South Vietnam, searching for an elusive enemy.
Like many parts of the country, Chicago was on edge, following several high-profile assassinations.
As we told you a moment ago, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas today.
Dr. Martin Luther King, civil rights leader, Nobel Prize winner, and apostle of nonviolence, died violently last night in Memphis, Tennessee.
Oh, my God. Senator Kennedy has been shot. And another man, a Kennedy campaign manager, and possibly shot in the head.
It was the peak of the fight for desegregation and Black civil rights, and racist tensions often boiled over into the streets.
Remember, Malika, my immediate family, and there were about 9 or 10 of us in one car, were in a race riot in Chicago 11 years before the Democratic Convention.
That August, residents watched the city head for another confrontation, just outside the convention hall. The establishment versus a mass anti-war movement. My dad went out to document it.
I was pledging the fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha Incorporated, and our big brothers had informed us a few weeks before the DNC, do not go anywhere near downtown Chicago during this convention. They did not want us to be in the vicinity. Well, I was considering myself a photographer. And I also considered myself wanting to be a journalist. So I loaded one camera with black and white film, and I loaded the other camera with color slide film. And I had talked to some of my fellow pledges, and I told them, I'm going down there. And I did. I got there with my cameras and my tripod and started taking photographs. And there were quite a few people in Grant Park at the time because it was a time of the hippies and the yippies. And they had decided they were going to gather there and involve themselves in anti-war protests. And I wanted to document it. And so I did. Even though the fraternity told us, don't go, I went. I wasn't down there long before I noticed the police coming in mass. Blue helmeted police, and they had their blue vests on, and they had their, we called them at the time, billy clubs. Sticks, wooden sticks.
Thus, the night that Vice President Humphrey was to receive the Democratic Party's nomination for president was also the night of the bloodiest confrontation. Denied a permit to march to the amphitheater, they gathered in Grant Park, across the street from the now hated Hilton Hotel.
Anyone close to a policeman was subject to getting hit with a stick. I started taking photographs. I would shoot while running because I didn't want to get hit with a billy club. Everything I shot was blurry. And I realized afterwards, that's because I didn't sit still. I didn't compose my shots. I was taking photographs while running. It taught me that I'm not equipped to be a journalist, a photojournalist, under circumstances like that.
This week, I'm picking up the mantle. And while my dad did send me a screenshot of a Wikipedia page pointing out the DNC has been held in Chicago since, I still wanted to hear about the parallels to that pivotal year.
My name is Garrison Hayes. I am a video correspondent for Mother Jones, and I'm based in Nashville. I make videos on the internet mostly about race and politics and history.
Well, Garrison, it's really good to have you on The Take. We are speaking to you ahead of this year's DNC in Chicago. And when some people hear about a Chicago DNC during a war that the U.S. is involved in, the year 1968 probably comes to mind.
We are on the verge potentially of a repeat of the 1968 DNC protests at a convention in Chicago.
There's a saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. What do you make of the parallels?
Yeah, I mean, 2024 and 1968 are absolutely rhyming. They aren't the same, and that's worth saying. But there are enough similarities that it feels reasonable. It feels right to make the comparison. Obviously, you have Joe Biden deciding not to seek re-election. That's 2024.
I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation.
But in 1968, it was Lyndon B. Johnson who decided on March 31st that he wouldn't seek re-election.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The circumstances are certainly different, that's worth saying, but they're similar in that Joe Biden is engaged and entangled in what has been deemed a genocidal war taking place in Palestine. And Lyndon Johnson was engaged far more directly in a genocide taking place in Vietnam at the time. And both of these wars are deeply unpopular and certainly affecting the way that Americans see and perceive their country and their patriotism and their willingness to vote for these two candidates, both in 1968 and today.
Okay, so for people listening who are shaking their fist at their smart speaker or their phone because they say, let's talk about the differences. What are the differences?
So the major difference is that in 1968, the U.S. was fighting unpopular and genocidal war in Vietnam. Those were our troops on the ground fighting this war and engaging in this genocide. Today, the U.S. is funding the war. They are providing weapons and aid to Israel as they go to war against Hamas. And the outcomes have been, of course, deemed a genocide as the result. But we aren't, there aren't American troops on the ground. It's different. This is a foreign ally that we are aiding in their war as opposed to us fighting that war.
Well, let's move to the politics of it all, the differences and the similarities there. Let's talk about the candidates. In 1968, the Democratic Party ended up rallying around the then vice president. Something similar is happening this year. What is the same or different about 1968's candidates versus 2024's candidates?
So in 1968, Democrats are worried who's going to replace Lyndon B. Johnson. And there were a few people who came to mind, but perhaps most prominently was Bobby Kennedy.
I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies. I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course.
Bobby Kennedy was an anti-war candidate who was also still deeply connected to the Democratic establishment at the time. So he felt like he could really win. He could win kind of both factions, those who were more establishment, as well as those who were a little bit more progressive and against the war. But as we know,
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? Is that possible? It could. Is it possible, ladies and gentlemen?
Bobby Kennedy gets assassinated in June, just before the convention in Chicago. And so this throws the party into all kinds of chaos about who will they coalesce around. And ultimately, the decision was to select, through kind of party politics, his vice president, Hubert Humphrey.
And the chair declares that Vice President Hubert Humphrey is the Democratic President candidate of the United States.
I pledge myself to that task of leading the Democratic Party to victory in November.
And this was certainly seen as the safe route. LBJ endorsed his vice president to be the candidate, which is, maybe a reminiscent of what we've seen today. But the candidate himself, Humphrey, just wasn't as popular. He wasn't as charismatic or magnetizing for the party. This is a big difference for today. We see Vice President Kamala Harris has really pulled the party together.
I stand before you today to proudly announce I am now officially the Democratic nominee for President of the United States.
A lot of people are excited. There are factions across the political spectrum who are interested in getting her elected. And so that's another big difference.
So that's what was happening on one side of the aisle. Are there any comparisons or similarities to be drawn with the Republicans?
I think there are reasonable comparisons to be drawn with Republicans in 1968 and Republicans in 2024. Republicans had nominated their candidate of choice, Richard Nixon.
I will be the strongest candidate, and I believe I can beat Lyndon Johnson.
Now, many people have drawn reasonable comparisons between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump. For one, they both ran on a law and order platform.
Time is running out for the merchants of crime and corruption in American society. The wave of crime is not going to be the wave of the future in the United States of America.
Terrorists are coming in at numbers that we've never seen before. Bad things are going to happen. Meanwhile, our crime rate is going up while crime statistics all over the world are going down because they're taking their criminals and they're putting them into our country.
We saw at the RNC Trump and his allies talking about deporting millions of people they have deemed to be illegals. We've seen them talking about funding police. Much of this rhetoric is actually pulled from the Richard Nixon playbook. Richard Nixon ran on law and order, but specifically related to campus protests that, in 1968, we saw the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., of course, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. We saw civil unrest across the country. And the way that Nixon framed it was that Democrats can't lead this country. They can't get people under control, but I will. And so he's running TV ads with images of students protesting and Black people protesting in the streets against racial injustice and leveraging that fear tactic to gain political power.
Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence.
And we're seeing some similar things again here today. At the RNC just last month, Trump and his allies brought out some of the students who were opposed to pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses.
I am the proud plaintiff suing Harvard University for its failure to combat anti-Semitism.
So we're seeing some of those similarities play out in that way as well.
After the break, an activist from the 1968 DNC returns this year to protest another war.
there we were. You know, some of us, white activists, middle class from campuses, were being beaten. And that was a real lesson. And that changed me, and it changed a lot of people.
Howie Emmer was at the Chicago DNC in 1968.
And I'm also attending the 2024 Democratic National Convention protests in Chicago, again, 56 years later. People began to see it's not just the Republicans, it's not just the Democrats. You know, maybe it's a system, an oppressive system that's going to be violent no matter who's in power.
Back then, Howie was 21. His activism led him to become one of the founders of a chapter of Students for a Democratic Society, which meant more than a few brushes with history.
I was actually in college at Kent State, where in 1970, 4 students were killed and 9 were wounded.
The guardsmen opened fire on the students.
67 shots.
Protesting the war in Vietnam and the invasion in Cambodia.
And back then, Howie made his journey from Ohio to Chicago, knowing full well there'd be consequences.
So Chicago Mayor Daley told people before the convention he would give no permits to march and people better not come. And actually, that did diminish the size of the demonstrations because the Chicago police already had a reputation for being really mean, violent cops. But I went anyway, that's right, because it was genocide in Vietnam.
10,000 anti-war demonstrators gathered in Grant Park this afternoon before a planned march on the amphitheater.
In Chicago, I witnessed the brutality. I remember at one point, there was a line of us demonstrators, then there was a line of police. Right in the middle, there was like a no person's land. A bystander, a woman who was downtown Chicago, she had a dress on, she wasn't part of anything. She was walking in that space. I saw police just jump on her and start beating her up.
Many of the injured were attacked as they stood quietly watching the waves of police charge the protesters in the streets.
I was in another line where a number of us linked arms to prevent the police from beating up demonstrators. Right near me, the police broke through the line, started beating people's heads who were in that line. And I was part many times of chanting, you know, the whole world is watching.
The whole world is watching, chants the crowd on the side.
So I witnessed firsthand state violence, and that really affected me.
So, Garrison, we talked earlier about law and order. A lot of the comparisons between 2024 and 1968 stem from a fear of the violent police response to the protests in 68. What's the government and law enforcement doing this time around?
I think the way that the police will engage with the inevitability of protesters at the 2024 DNC will be huge. It will be really, really important to maintaining safety. In 1968, you had a mayor of Chicago who was almost rabid in his desire to see violence from the Chicago Police Department.
Mm-hmm.
Some have said that he called for them to shoot on sight. Yeah. That's how crazy it was at that time. Today, Chicago has a relatively progressive mayor who actually comes from a protest background. He understands the importance of Americans' First Amendment right to free speech and protest and demonstration and assembly, and he's affirmed that. Now, of course, this has led some Democrats to wonder if he is going to prioritize the safety and the security of this event. But he is assured that this will be a safe convention and that his officers are ready to keep order in the Chicago streets. I'm hopeful that that will happen. Like, if they can kind of manage all of those things, it would be a really huge win.
Yeah. Well, Garrison, what lessons has the U.S. learned or not learned since 1968 as a country?
This is a great question. And
not answerable in a 20-minute interview, but maybe give me the highlights.
1968 was such an important year for racial progress. To add some additional context to that year, Martin Luther King Jr. is pushing for the Poor People's Campaign, which would radically reshape the way we think about poor people. And of course, he's assassinated tragically. And the protests that break out as a result of his assassination, the protests against the Vietnam War, it would help to finish the work that MLK was leading and other civil rights leaders were pushing forward. I think we are looking at an opportunity to move our country forward or to go back to the kind of rhetoric that feels all too familiar in America. And I think the biggest lesson from 1968 is that every election, every moment is actually really important, and making the right decision is really, really important. And I'm hopeful that the American people will think strategically about what they want this country to be going forward. And I'm hopeful that it is a country that is inclusive and that seeks justice for all people.
Howie, the 1968 protester, says this is a new moment, but the echoes are still there.
I think there have been steps forward made, but the steps forward made, in my opinion, are in the consciousness of people. So take this moment, for example. People around the world now are really upset. Billions of people, about the genocide being committed in Gaza by Israel and our country. So that's a consciousness, that's a new consciousness that has not been there about Palestine. But I want to say that no, institutionally, things have not changed. They've even gotten worse. I actually don't believe that there's more freedom. I think there's less freedom. And it's a stubborn, oppressive society that we live in, is what I came to believe in the 1960s. And I think, unfortunately, our government proves that every day.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Chloe K. Lee, Ashish Malhotra, Sonia Bhagat, and me, Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Wazwaz. The Take production team is Amy Walters, Ashish Malhotra, Catherine Nouhan, Chloe K. Lee, Duha Mosaad, Hagir Saleh, Khaled Soltan, Manahil Naveed, Marcos Bartolomé, Noor Wazwaz, Sarí el-Khalili, Shraddha Joshi, Sonia Bhagat, Tamara Khandaker, and Veronique Eshaya. I'm your host, Malika Bilal. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.